Hello, everyone. This is Sarah Lowenstein. I am the marketing specialist here at Embarcadero. I'm going to be sort of facilitating our webinar today with your presenter, Marco Cantu. Today, we're going to talk about the new updates to RAD Server, and Marco's going to kind of walk you through some of the key new features that have been added and the new functionality that will help you save time and improve your app's performance. Just a few reminders before we start here. If you have any questions, there is a question panel on your GoToWebinar control panel. If you are experiencing any issues, particularly with audio or video, please feel free to reach out there and I'll be happy to help you out and help you troubleshoot. A lot of times, one of the biggest issues is, or one of the biggest resolutions is just restarting your computer and rejoining. Everyone is on mute and will be for the entire webinar. At the end, we will address your questions in a question and answer session. Right now, I believe Marco's presentation is going to be around 45 minutes, and then we'll leave about 15 minutes for question and answers. If we go over, feel free to leave. There will be a recording available, and that will come via a follow-up email. And we'll also have that posted on our YouTube channel and our social media pages, which if you don't have, please follow us on Twitter. We're at Embarcadero Tech, and on Facebook at Embarcadero Technologies. So I'm going to pass it over to Marco, and we thank you again for joining.
Thanks. So my name is Marco Cantu. I'm one of the RAD Studio product managers, and I'm focused on a few things, including Delphi and including RAD Server. So that's why I'm hosting this session today. The session is not an introduction, although I do have an introductory demo just to make sure that everyone is on the same page and aligned. But it's not really meant to be an introduction or to cover all of the features that RAD Server has had over time, but mostly focus on what we have done throughout the 10.2.x releases and updates in terms of additional features added to RAD Server, some guidelines, some considerations, and a lot of code that I meant to show more than showing slides. And so we're trying to focus on some of the JSON data processing options, some of the ability to host pages, performance and scalability. I do have a slide with some directions, and but that's not the focus either. So that's the idea. Have a short intro and then focus on a few selected areas that have been enhanced. First of all, what is RAD Server? Why are we investing on this technology? The idea is that that's the way you build a service-based architecture, reusing a lot of your existing code, mostly your database access code. The concept is quite straightforward. Rather than having like a monolithic large application, you end up with applications that provide the user interface, some front end, some local storage, some local business logic, but mostly rely on services that are available in the backend and are accessible through HTTP requests. Now, the idea is, again, that you can take some of the existing data access logic and move it from the typical client-server application to the backend and reuse or repurpose, if you want to go mobile and other platforms, your UI for the clients only. That helps more flexibility because you can update these services more continuously, helps improving the overall architecture, moving away from a monolithic architecture into fine-tuned services that you deploy side by side on the server, and then with specific focus clients that might use only specific services. Now, there are a lot of technologies around HTTP and web service access that I'm not going to cover in detail. We could spend a lot of time covering all of the HTTP methods, which are the operations you can do on a single endpoint, on a single resource and URL. We could spend a lot of time discussing the advantages and disadvantages of using JSON versus XML, but mostly what I'm going to cover is focus on JSON and focus on mostly GET operations, simple data processing operations. So though we'll see some of the other options and capabilities that a RAD server has. So having said this, what is RAD Server? RAD Server is a REST API hosting engine. So we provide the engine, you write the code for the APIs, but the engine has a lot of features available alongside, and I'm going to mention a few of these. RAD Server has a lot of features alongside, has user management groups. We'll touch on users and security. It has analytics, and it's a ready-to-use system compared to do-it-yourself kind of application, like other solutions that have this space are focused on. So what do you do when you want to create an API? The concept around RAD Server is that RAD Server is an engine, and you create packages in Delphi or C++ Builder, and those packages are hosted and loaded by RAD Server itself. So what you do in your package, you implement some APIs, and then you can call those APIs from browser or from a client application. Okay, so let's do it. Now, I do have an existing application ready, which is not the one I wanted to show, but I'm actually going to close all, and at least at the very beginning, create one from scratch, because it is really straightforward. So what I'm going to do is create a RAD Server package, and I'm going to create a package with a resource. I could add the resource later on. I'm going to give it a name, tempo. Okay, I need to copy this one and finish, and this is it. So we have this data module as a placeholder. We have some ready-to-use endpoints. I've automatically generated the code for get and get item, and then all I need to do is to run this. And if I run it, I get very simple UI, which is just a console. I've enabled logging so you can see what's happening behind the scenes. And then the next thing you would do is to grab a browser, which I have here, if I can find it, and simply type in your endpoint, and this is the result of the call. It's a very simple JSON string, nothing fancy, but it literally took me half a minute to get this up and running. Now, I'm not building and creating this application, as I mentioned. What I'm building and creating is a package, and this package is automatically configured if we go and check the run parameters to run the development version of RAD Server or EMS server as a host application. So the package is loaded in the context of this application, which allows like full debugging and everything. And the application, the package is passed as parameter to the server itself. So it's a very straightforward, ready-to-use architecture to get going and debugging. Now, that's not your deployment mode. For deployment, there are other options which include ISAPI module or an Apache module. And of course, the Apache module is also available on Linux once we build this with a Linux target. So again, it doesn't take a lot to get going, but I'm going to switch back to the previous demo because this demo actually has two sides. One is the server, and let me spend 1 extra second looking at the server and the code, but I also have a ready-to-use client that I can use. So what I've done with the wizard was provide a name for the resource. This is attribute that decorates my data module, or could be a class as well. And this is registered at startup. So basically the system, the RAD server engine knows that this resource is available, and this URL is mapped to the resource by the mean of this registration and this resource name parameter. Now, for each of the various methods that you publish, you can map them to the get, post, put, delete operations. Get is the default. The other thing you can do is use a suffix so that the first element of the URL is mapped to the resource name, but an optional second element of the URL is mapped to this item value. So if I run this, and let me run it and keep this source code visible here, and now get back my browser and make this small. See, now if I run it and say I want to get to the Delphi endpoint, oh, weird. Oh, I know what happened. Sorry, I didn't stop the previous one, so it was already running. Now let me see. Oh, funny. No, it was a different thing. I started the client rather than the server. Now the server is running. If I hit the server, I can get the result. Delphi add, this is my local time. And so I'm hitting this URL. If I pass an additional parameter, Delphi/grade, then I'm going to hit the second entry point because there is an item parameter, and the parameter is passed to my code, and in this case I just displayed, but I could use it as a element in a query, in a filter, or a parameter that for my logic and application logic. Okay, so that's the straightforward, that's the idea. Now this is my server, and the server is still running. You can use any HTTP client, you can use the browser, as I was saying, but you can also create custom HTTP clients, and you can do those with RAD Studio, either Delphi or C++ Builder again. The only thing, the helpers that you have rather than doing plain HTTP request is this EMS provider component. The provider is just a general component where you configure the access. In this case, we're using HTTP, and it's localhost and 8080, and we can right click to test the connection to the server. When we do it, it executes the /version URL, which is a default ready to use URL with the version and the server name. Now this is the global configuration. If I want to do execute the code at an endpoint or a URL, I can drop a backend endpoint component, hook it to the provider, and then provide the name of the resource. Eventually, I could also provide both the name of the resource and a suffix for the resource. Okay, so in this code, I'm just using the name. So all I have to do is to execute the backend endpoint and then read the JSON from the response. If I want to provide a parameter, I modify the resource suffix at runtime, and then all I have to do again is grab the result. So if I now run this client, and get it here, when I do get data, I get a similar result. And when I pass an item, I get that added to the string, to the hard-coded string in the server. So it's fairly straightforward to create and this clients. Now, back to the server, you have a context, which is the execution context that gives general information. You have a request, so you can have access to any of the HTTP request parameter. You can have query strings. You can check the content type that were requested, the accepted response types. You can really leverage the entire HTTP protocol. And similarly for the response, it's open-ended. You can, of course, just set the body, but you can also set a different response content type. And there are multiple possible ways for setting a result in the body. The main ones are setting a value, which is by default a JSON value. So a tJSON value object, or an object that inherits from tJSON value, could be a JSON array, a JSON object, or of course a combination of arrays and objects in any data structure. You can return a stream, so just bytes, or a stream, okay? Or, and we'll get to that in a second, use a JSON writer, which is an optimized mechanism for writing to the output directly. Now notice that when you're using a JSON string or any JSON value, what happens is that you're creating a lot of objects in memory, and as those objects are saved to a string, and the string is returned in the stream. For large data structures, this is not optimal an idea. Which brings me back to the slides. Oops, not this one. Good. And to the next one, which is how to generate JSON data. So you can generate strings. That's what we've done so far. It's pretty simple, but not terribly powerful. JSON objects, you can return any complex JSON object. You can, again, create an array of objects, for example, representing a record or another data structure. But you can also use streams, binary data, or anything. The string can be a stream with JSON data, but can also be a stream with any other binary data that's possibly recognized with a content type on the internet, although it's not a given. If you write both the client and the server, it could be a totally custom data structure. And as I mentioned, a JSON writer. Now, I'm going to show a demo that shows this directly, but also through some of the FARDAC mechanisms. So FARDAC originally had a streaming mechanism. So you can take any FARDAC query and result and save it to a stream. I'm going to show that to you. That's what you, in most cases, don't want to do, specifically if the client is not a RAD Studio client. Also using FARDAC, because FARDAC streaming is very specific. What we added, I think was in either 10.1 or 10.2, is an extension to the batch move architecture, which generally is an architecture for copying a data set into a different data set, into a different representation of the same data set. For example, you can use it for running a query against Oracle and then insert the results into SQL Server. But you can also go from comma delimited file to Oracle, or Oracle to comma delimited file, or any other combination. And what we've added is for support for writing to JSON. So that's what I'm going to point to in the next demo, which should be just around here. RAD server. Wait. Generate JSON. So this is a slightly different approach. As you can see, I have a single package, but I have multiple endpoints implemented each, well, with the same database component because I've been lazy and just copied them over. But this shows different ways to implement something similar in terms of result. And I don't even have a client. I'm just going to show how you can see the resulting JSON in a browser. So first thing is the traditional way, which again is far from ideal unless you're using Fireduck for both client and server. This is a connection to database. The query is straightforward. Select start from employee, or just a placeholder to get something done. And then there is a little bit of code here, not too much, because what we want to do is to return a stream from that component. So in short, what we need to do is create a memory stream, assign this memory stream as the response object, and this true parameter means that it is the response or RAD server, after all, that's going to delete the object from memory, because we can say free here. Otherwise, we're going to destroy the object before it's used by the engine to create the result. So it's handy to give ownership of the memory stream to the system. And then what we do is basically save to stream. Now what this does, and this is assigned to an Fireduck resource. So let's run it because that's always a good way to get things done. And of course, I need to close the previous instance because they're all set by default at the same port. And now it is running and we can get to the browser. And this time I'm going to change the URL to employee Fireduck. And this is my result. Now that's a lot of JSON. Fine, that's not the problem. The problem is that this is not the clean JSON that a JavaScript application would expect. It has a header, it's Fireduck. It has a version, it has general information, metadata, where this comes from, the original columns, the type name, the type in the database, blah, 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 and eventually also the actual data with some name value pairs. But it is not what a general JavaScript client would need and expect. Again, it's great if all you need is grab a mem table, Fireduck mem table. You can copy it into, and it will handle updates, differences, and eventually help you do a proper commit of the local change to the server, because it can track the update cache. But for general purpose JavaScript, that's not a good approach. So we have a couple of different things. One is using a writer. Now, before I get to the full writer demo, I wanted to introduce the concept of a writer. So the writer is a class that was introduced some time ago that help you basically do something. It's the reverse of a SAX engine, of a parsing engine. So what you do is you logically output elements from the JSON. This is an example, write start object. So we have a new object, square bracket, in practical terms. Write property name. So there is a name value pair and the name is test. Then there is a value and the value is foobar, going to put in within double quotes and everything for you. And then write an object. You can have another object. You can have multiple properties within the same object. You can have an array. So you are creating elements for the JSON, but ultimately what happens is that this code is going to be written to a stream directly. And again, that's different from creating a bunch of objects in memory for each JSON element and then saving those JSON elements to a string and then copying that string to the output stream. This approach is much faster, uses less memory, and it's efficient both in memory and CPU time, because the output is written directly to the response stream, and the response stream is already the socket response over the wire. So you can start pushing results to the other end before you have finished generating the HTTP response, which is extremely efficient. So this is the code. Let me run this and show this to you, and then we'll enable the actual code, which is the one below. Okay, so this was already running, I think. Okay, so this is my code. So just an object with a single name value pair with property JSON formatting. Okay, now let me do this. Of course, I need to stop the server. Good. And then I'm going to change this. I'm going to comment this section and uncomment this section. So we can use the JSON writer to directly. So we can assign a different JSON writer to the JSON writer response object. And what we can do, we can grab the batch move writer. So in short, here's my connection and my query. Now I have a batch move architecture object. This is where you can customize and define mappings, like which fields you want to map to which fields. You can filter, you can have custom formatting for your JSON. There are a lot of things you can configure. But in short, what's happening, I have a reader that reads from my employee table, from my query, and then I have a writer. So the data is going to move from the table through the reader to the writer. And the writer is eventually hooked to the JSON writer, so it's going to be returned as my HTTP response. I mean, the content of the writer itself. Again, there is a lot of flexibility in the mapping you can do between one side and the other. There are encodings and formattings that you can customize, for example, of the indentation elements for JSON and a lot of other features that are very nice to have compared to writing this code manually. And so in other words, with no code, we can create a nicely customized JSON output, which is also fairly flexible. So now I'm going to enable this, get back to my browser, refresh it, and now we have a much nicer looking JSON data structure because each object has its own set of name value pairs. So it's just an array of objects, and each object represents a single record from my table. No metadata, no additional content, just smooth, direct mapping to the result. And basically no code, because all I have is do this association and then say, hey, execute the batch move operation. Now the last thing is this direct streaming. So just to show that you can have even more flexibility. Again, here I'm using the same batch move architecture, but rather than the writer, I'm just writing to the JSON to the memory stream. Okay. So I'm not associating the writer to the writer anymore. I'm saying the writer writes to a stream that I've provided, and then my response will be the content of the stream. And in this case, I need to provide the content type from my HTTP result. In all practical terms, this JSON2 does exactly the same of the previous JSON URL. So there is really no difference between one and the other. Oops, sorry, I ended up closing this one. Should be employee 2. Okay, so same content, but obtained through a stream in memory rather than the direct writer to the output. There is likely some difference in performance using one or the other approach. The writer should be slightly more efficient, but also stream is fairly fast. Okay, so that's one area I wanted to cover, and I should get back to the slide. Now, the last thing I want to mention, and then I'll hint to a couple more advanced topics, is building web apps. So what we've done is added the ability in 10.2.3 for RAD Server to return static files. So we're not just going to return something generated in the application, but something that exists on your hard drive. This is handy specifically for the development server because you can return HTML and JavaScript that uses endpoints for the actual processing. So you can integrate a JavaScript HTML application with your backend services. And in this case, I'm not even going to use ExtJS, and I know there are several demos of ExtJS around. Some I've done in the past, but I want to keep this to the bare minimum because that should let you see the steps and have a better understanding of what's happening. Now, before I do that, I need to introduce you the configuration engine behind RAD Server, which is this EMS server ini file. This is where you configure everything in your system. And in this case, it's in this new section that was added, server public paths. Server public path is the engine that lets you map a number of path objects, and these names are just completely irrelevant. You can map a URL, which is the path, with a folder, which is expressed with this notation. You can determine if you want to return anything on the folder or just only files with given extensions, or files that can be mapped to specific MIME types, so like images. And you can also provide a default. So if you do not put a file name, you can return the index.html or whatever is your default for the file name. Now, this is handy because it allows you to have the web service return the file from the same domain from your request, so you don't need to set the to create too much trouble with cross header request, and which is manageable, but it's additional configuration and at times can be a little tricky. I was looking for that configuration, but I don't remember what that is. So anyway, so the idea is, if we do this, we are able to create a very simple, complete application that has in this case a very simple do nothing method called XYZ. That's the only one that I'm going to invoke, so almost do nothing. But the idea is I can invoke it from web application, and that web application, let me start this first. That web application would can be invoked by using the content token. And as you see, and I'm getting you to the code, as I press the button, I'm running this same method here from within the web application. Now, the web application in itself is fairly straightforward. I can even show it directly in the browser. Let me make this a little bigger. So all it does is has some static HTML. It uses jQuery. And then when you're clicking on the button, which is this button object, we are going to execute /XYZ. And if the function returns, grabbing the result and copying into this div1 element. So it's really a one-liner. Well, JavaScript is odd. A one-liner, three-level nested anonymous method or closure. But that's what it is. And what it does is allows you to access to data on the same server that's also returning the HTML and eventually a separate JavaScript file. In this case, it's all embedded locally. So next thing is something we've just delivered a couple of weeks ago. It's part of the 10.3 new cut, the cut we did when we did the community edition. So if you've installed over the last 3 days or 4 days, you already have these features. If not, there is a patch that you can download. And it's a significant patch to RAD Server that helps performance in many different areas, mostly through some change in the license checking, some change in the memory management, and some optimization. Now, the difference is quite straightforward. So this is the same XYZ method I was showing. And if I connect from my Mac to my Windows PC running this server, without the patch, I could get roughly 100 requests a second. So almost a full 10 milliseconds per request. With the patch, I can get 3,000 requests a second. So for a do nothing method, it's a 3,000% increase, or 30 times more throughput compared to the previous version. Now, of course, if you're doing a lot of work in the processing, then the difference is not so critical, but it's still relevant, and also, again, affected by the fact that in a heavy multi-threaded situation, the memory manager has now a better configuration, and so things go more smoothly in terms of memory allocation and deallocation. So again, from a heavy data-driven operation, one of those returning like an entire table, the change is from roughly 50 requests a second to 400 requests a second. So it's roughly 10 times more throughput and better performance compared to before using the patch. So a couple of more things in this last few minutes. I was hoping to cover a couple more, but I'll just touch on authentication and authorization because I do have a ready demo to go. There are two areas there that are worth mentioning. There is full control on authentication and authorization. You can have permissions tied to the application and a unique application ID. You can have secret keys that are embedded for kind of giving admin power to specific users. And there is a very sophisticated mechanism overall. Now, by default, you add users within the server itself, and then those users, and then the RAD server does checks the user and password. But there is a way to create a custom login module for custom login. So you could log in against an existing system, an Active Directory, architecture, or any other external system your company is using. That's I'm going to demo. I'm not going to demo Edge modules, which is a nice, interesting way to dynamically add resources, map to URLs, or multi-tenancy, or push notification. These are all great areas, but we have only so much time. So let me touch a second on authentication and authorization. And what I need to do again is to enable it in my EMS server INI file, which is where I would configure my permissions. So what I'm going to do is go back to the previous demo and enable these two settings. This says that every user can do login Well, otherwise, that's tricky, although you can restrict login in some specific circumstances. And then the Delphi resource is available to all users that are authenticated. So if you're not authenticated, you cannot use /Delphi anymore. That's one thing. The other thing is that I'm installing a custom login in this server. So it's one of the server redirect. So what I'm saying, when someone is asking for a login, I actually redirect the person to a different endpoint that's called custom login. So rather than doing the standard, I'm doing something special for login. Now let me add the correct, open the correct demo here. And that's going to be the permissions demo, which is a slight change to the previous demo. So I have the same server with the same endpoint, and now if I run it and I use my browser and I hit Delphi. Oops. Yeah, if I can type it. Well, it should have told me that I'm not authorized. So I did something wrong in the configuration. That's smooth. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have done the all users thing, because that include unauthenticated user. So let's say this. And I need to restart the server to get the new configuration going. Okay, let me try once more. If not, I'll just continue and I'll. Okay, so now I'm not allowed to do this operation. Okay, what I can do though in the client form is add a backend authentication object that is hooked to my provider and to my specific endpoints. And then the authentication object has the credentials. Well, yeah, whatever. Of a user that I've created in the system. And then there is a login button, which just calls the login operation. So it's quite straightforward. So now the server is running. Let me run the client. I need to log in first. Oh, weird. Shoot. Okay, it was working. I think I might have accidentally disabled the login operation in the system. That is weird though. Let me double check once more, because this should give an error. And if I log in, nope. It doesn't let me in. I might have accidentally changed the password. That one surprised me. Okay, well, but basically that's the architecture you need to do to enable the oh no, shoot, I know what's happening. That's silly. Sorry, let me run it once more. I promise I'm doing 2 steps at once, so that's not great. Notice what happens here. Says unauthorized request, wrong password here, and it should have prompted me because this is my code. So what I did, I added a module in my server to do custom authentication. This is not different from any other server module. but it's configured in the configuration file as a new version of the login operation. And so what happens here is that I'm doing this login rather than the other login. Now, there are two things interesting here. Well, this piece of code lets you do an internal request. So I'm calling another RAD server method, which is the original login method, because I still want to log in the user as the original thing. But then I'm also doing this test that if the user is the same of the password, I'm not allowing the user to work for some reason. Now, if I change this, now I'm requiring that the username and the password are the same. So let me get back to the server. Let me shut down the server. Now I'm recompiling the server with this different logic. And now my client, which hopefully is still running. No, I stopped it. And now my client can actually authenticate me and let me execute the code, because now I'm authenticated user. Now, what happens when you authenticate that you get back an extra header. So if you're using standard HTTP JavaScript call, you need to grab that extra header and pass it back to the next call so that it refers to the authenticated information and the proper account for the user. Okay, so that's the last thing I wanted to show. And a couple of things very shortly. What's coming along for RAD Server? We're going to completely redo the mapping engine, the mapping of resources to server-side code. We're going to go beyond URLs and the HTTP methods to include content type, accept types, and other information. We're going to get to allow different types of mapping. So rather than having a class with specific scenario that get registered in the system to map a resource, you can have addition. You can forward the request to another class or component, and we're going to provide ready-to-use components to simplify some of the code and some additional performance. So what I've tried to show you, you can use RAD Server now for hosting web APIs, return JSON data. You can use it as a web application backend. You can use it as a regular client in the backend. We have improved performance and created more flexible architecture and added many additional features, and we've explored some of those that could fit into this time. Here are some useful resources: the RAD Server homepage, the internal documentation on DocWiki, and by far and most, there's this 80 pages white paper that was originally written by Carrie Jensen. It refers to EMS, which is the same server-side technology that powers RAD Server, so don't worry about the name. It doesn't cover the latest feature, but it's a very detailed and comprehensive white paper, specifically focused on FireDoc integration. So it's a recommended reading for anyone starting with RAD Server. And with that, I can open it up for questions. Sorry for having me a little longer than expected, but well, there was a bunch of things I wanted to cover. Okay, so let me go through some of the questions and try to go in order because that makes sense. So push notification, yes, RAD Server has support for push notifications. I haven't used them recently, but we have support for both Google and Apple notifications. And every device that you use in a RAD Server client using the proper components of the EMS client component. Lets you register the device and device ID on RAD Server. So it has that features. It's not part of RStudio Professional. It's not part of the FireDuck client server pack that is also discontinued. It's only found in Enterprise. Since one of the 10.2 patches, RAD Server, when you get RAD Server or Delphi or C++ Builder Enterprise, you also get one deployment license for the IIS/Apache module. So you get one deployment license for each enterprise license that your company has. So next question I see is about use of data modules. Yeah, in this case, I'm just dropping the data access component on each data module. That's not ideal. You can use an additional data module. You have to manage it considering that the RAD server methods are executed in a multi-threaded scenario. One of the things you need to do to get performance also locally, but that's the same you get automatically when you use the Apache or IIS, is some heavier multi-threading. So for example, you can enable thread pooling, set a thread pool size, and also keep alive equals true is good for improved performance against the local dev server. So you have multiple threads being executed at the same time. You need to make sure on your server method, if you're using a shared data module, that you manage the fact that you can have multi-threaded access. Now, for the database connection in FireDuck, you can also do pooling of the connection. So each thread needs its own connection to the database, but you can use pooling, so those are not recreated every time. And similarly, you can use server pooling for your web modules, and if you do things properly for your data modules. So you need to put some care to avoid everything work great at development, but then when you get heavy traffic, to get into deadlocks or multi-threaded access to the same physical resource, which is generally quite a big deal. The authentication schemes, we don't support, as I was saying, specific authentication schemes other than its own authentication, but with a custom login module, you can plug in any corporate service or corporate authentication scheme. And that should be fairly straightforward. No, there is a special offer RAD Server. RAD Server development tools come in RStudio, Architect and Enterprise, and Delphi Architect and Enterprise. You get one deployment license, and there's no other special offer. JSON strings are Unicode compatible. In general, they are. You can pick if you want UTF-8 output compared to Unicode. I think UTF-8 is actually the default, but I should double check that. I think it works pretty smoothly, but I haven't checked recently. Sorry. Yeah, the improvement on performance and scalability is quite significant. In terms of scalability, also consider that you need one instance of the RAD Server database, but with a single license, you can actually deploy multiple RAD Server engines on a few computers and then use a proxy, like an Apache RS related proxy on the front end. So you can have both fault tolerance and some load balancing through this architecture, which is quite nice. And technically, RAD Server is sessionless, so there's no session data in memory. So that's why you can have multiple RAD Server instances all answering to the same user, because the data is kept only in the database and it's fairly minimal. There's no session data on the server. That helps scalability quite a bit. Multi-tenancy, that's will be for our next demo. It's a powerful feature, but I couldn't cover it today. Static files, FireMonkey. Request and response are not global. These are objects that are passed to the method, and they are specific for that method and that request. Of course, multiple users pinging your server would have different response and request objects that are tied to the HTTP response and request. Let me see if there's anything else relevant. No, we currently don't have a Sencha Architect bundle. Sencha is a great tool for building the HTML and JavaScript side while keeping your business logic on RAD Server, but there isn't currently an offer. It's something that we have been discussed since the Sencha acquisition, but nothing to announce today. You can create packages for 64-bit platforms for Windows and Linux, and 32-bit platform for Windows. Given someone was asking about that. It is possible to use RAD Server on Linux. Yes, it comes as an Apache module. Now, if you have the original 10.2, it was broken. Sorry, we released a patch that was later merged into the latest updates of 10.2. So I think 10.2.3 has the Linux patch already. There's a question: what's the best way to return 10,000 records to a mobile device? It's paging. So do not create like a single response for 100,000 records. You can add a query param, like page or start from /page. There's several standard ways of doing this, but the recommendation is if you need to return 10,000 records, maybe split it in 10 requests or 100 requests, and then create one request after the other. You can start populating the UI while you are doing further processing on the server side. So, okay, there's another question. It's kind of rhetorical. How is RAD Server sold? So one license, so the development tools are all included, the development version, which has a limited license, and also some limited performance, honestly, even if we've improved it, is included. You get one license to deploy for each enterprise. The single license can be used for multi-tenancy and for failover servers, but it's still one license. If you need to deploy many licenses to all of your customers, contact sales, but we are really trying to make sure that price is not an issue for RAD Server going forward. It was when this was originally launched at a significantly higher price tag. Okay, there are other questions I'm not going to answer, like one, we're going to have the next Delphi. It's coming, we're working on it. And there's also a question, what can be done with RAD Server that couldn't be done with DataSnap Server? Oh, technically nothing. In fact, there is nothing you couldn't have done with Web Broker, which actually RAD Server piggybacks on. Web Server uses Web Broker as the foundation layer. It's just that things get simpler and easier and more flexible, which is one side. The other side of things, which I kind of failed to show, but is that everything also comes with this console architecture. So basically, you can do all of this tracking. You can see how many users were active, how many calls this user did. So I have full analytics of which functions were called, by who and when over time, who if it's a logged user, of course. So I can really get a lot of stats, or I can go for specific API calls. So here are all of my calls, Delphi, XYZ that I've done of the last hour. You can see all of the analytics with the call being done. You can see the client aligned, you can see the installations, which is like any phone that was hooked, the users, of course, and groups and management. So a lot of these features, plus actually many others that come built into the system, is something you would manually have to build with DataSnap or WebBroker or a low-level configuration. So given it's at the top of the hour, I think we could stop here, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar. If you have any follow-up question, you can reach me as marco.cantu@embarcadero.com, or through any other means you'll probably be able to find out. Thanks a lot for attending, and see you in a future webinar or in person around the world. Bye-bye.